answer is actually choice C, and I'm glad the majority got it. So let's go over this question together. Assume that an aged parent is being artificially kept alive, causing the family financial and emotional hardships. The passage implies that a utilitarian would most likely respond by keeping the parent alive only if doing so is beneficial to society as a whole. So let's go over why that is the right answer. Well, as we talked about, I'm going to get rid of, one second, let me just get rid of the numbers. So as we talked about, utilitarianism is only really talked about in here, right? And what does it say about it? So it says utilitarianism, which aims to calculate and institute the greatest good for the greatest number, not necessarily ruling out the possibility of sacrifice and suffering and sacrifice on the part of a minority. That's all we really get about utilitarianism. So the MCAT likely assumes that that's enough for us to make an inference of, right? So let's go back to the question and see how that relates. So keeping the parent alive only if doing so is beneficial to the society as a whole. Well, we know that they're not opposed to making sacrifices or allowing suffering for a minority if it benefits the greater good, right? It's all with utilitarianism, it's all about the greater good. If keeping the parent alive was for the greater good, then by all means keep the parent alive. Whereas if keeping the parent, not keeping the parent alive was more beneficial for society, then they would have no qualms about letting the parent die off, right? And that's why choice C is a good answer. But let's also talk about why A, B, and D are not right answers, right? A talks about balancing potential burdens on the family against burdens to society. Again, utilitarianism doesn't really want to place any burdens on society. It actually wants to make, it wants to remove any burdens from society, even if that means letting somebody die or letting somebody suffer or whatever. So it doesn't want to balance potential burdens. It wants to keep the burden on the family rather than balance the burdens from the family onto society. It doesn't want any burdens on society. That's the whole point, right? It wants society to prosper, even if one family or one small group has to bear a lot of the burden or the struggle. Okay, that's why I don't think A is the right answer. B, arguing that the parent, as a member of the contracting unit, had an equal voice and decision. This you can mark off right away as wrong because utilitarianism has nothing to do with contracting unit. That's only in contractarianism. That has nothing to do with utilitarianism. So that you can mark off right away. D, upholding the parent's right to life against any potential lessening of the family's hardship. Again, utilitarianism, the only thing we saw about it is that they are okay with sacrifice and suffering. Therefore, they don't really care about the parent's right to life. They are willing to let the parent die if it means lessening of the family's hardship. If the family, which maybe constitutes 5 people, will live better if that one person dies, well, then that's the way it will be, right? Because the greater good, more people will benefit if the parent dies. They don't want to uphold the parent's right to life if it means other people will suffer. More people will suffer. Does this make sense to everybody? Any questions by the way?
I had a quick question about the wording of C. So when it says beneficial to society as a whole, how do you interpret as a whole? Because for me, I was thinking that that means that all of society would be benefited, but utilitarianism really cares about the majority of society, right? Not necessarily every single person. So that's how I was interpreting as a whole. So I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
I see. So that's a little bit, I see what you're saying. And that's a little bit, I think, like kind of you're thinking about it too much in a way. So utilitarianism does focus on the greater good for the most number of people. And that's really what they consider society as a whole. So if the net gain for a lot of people is like, if for a lot of people, it's a net gain, even for a couple people, it's a net loss. As a whole in society, as like a unit, it'll be a net gain, right? And that's what they mean. So as a society, even if the death causes suffering for not only the parent, but maybe a couple of members of the family or something else, they'll take like a loss, but society as a whole, or the rest of society, will net gain. And because a lot of people gain, only a couple people lost, the system of society, the society as a whole, will gain. Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? So how do we distinguish between making inference and bringing inside outside info? Think, what did they tell you? Well, inferences kind of does involve a little bit of outside info. It involves like rationalizing skills. So a little bit of outside info, but like nothing specific about the topic, that makes sense. So think about what they gave you, right? About utilitarianism, and I'll go back. And like I mentioned, they gave you very little about it. So you have to think in your mind, am I assuming that something is true that the article or the question didn't specifically say? Well, if so, then it might not be. So sometimes it's hard to say, because also sometimes you do have to make some leaps, and that's like the whole point. You have to make inferences, leaps in like reasoning. You have to get from point A to point B somehow, right? So you do have to use a little bit of outside knowledge, but it's mostly, can you get where you got just based on the info they gave you? That's what you have to think about. And they gave you that greatest good for the greatest number, possibility of sacrifice and suffering on the part of the minority. And that's what you have to work with. And if you see, getting this answer choice, keeping the parent alive only if doing so is beneficial to society as a whole, for the greater good, not necessarily ruling out suffering or sacrifice. Yes, but like Janelle mentioned also in the chat, try not to bring in any outside info on a topic that didn't specifically mention. Sometimes this could be hard, but yeah, it helps. This is one of the ways I would say, like, if you don't know like anything about what they're talking about, it actually does help a little bit, because you can't bring outside info because you don't know any outside info. But yeah.
Thanks for explaining. So Mark, you remember that slide you had under something where it's a book, a theory, an idea, mixture of book, technology, all of that? How much seconds do we have to, you gave us 10 minutes to read the passage. I'm not sure how much minutes we'd be allowed to answer the question. When do we make these determination, whether it's a technology, you know?
As you're reading it the first time. So I would say, so I gave you 10 minutes to read the passage and also a couple minutes to answer the questions. Actually, on the MCAT, it's 10 minutes to read and answer all the questions associated with the passage. So I gave you a little more time. You should probably be, at least, what is this? Something you should be identifying within the first minute or two. This passage with the comment is the author trying to praise. That's something you would probably get once you finish the passage, possibly once you start the questions, possibly. But I would say try and have it by the time you finish reading the passage the first time. And then, because I usually read the passage quickly the first time, and then when a question asks me to go back to the passage, I always go back to the passage to where it was found in the passage, right?
So it's a mental assessment, not necessarily me physically saying, oh, this looks like a technology passage, or oh, this looks like a, let's see, what else we have, a criticism.
So yeah, that's actually exactly how I think about it. As I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, so if I two concepts of social philosophy are utilitarianism and, oh, well, this is a philosophy thing. Okay. They're talking about utilitarianism and contractarianism. Okay, I've heard about these words before. Okay, and then I finish the first paragraph, and then maybe I'm thinking about it's a compare contrast, but I already know what the thing is, and it's at least contractarianism and possibly utilitarianism, but it's these two philosophical ideas, right? I already know what this thing is. I think at least have an idea, and then yeah. And then once I get to like more and I say, okay, they're not comparing, contrasting, they're more describing. Oh, well, they're also defending and praising and doing all this. But from the first paragraph, I already have an idea. This is a philosophy thing, specifically about these two philosophical ideas. And this is how you usually will figure it out, right?
And my last thing is, you see how you just got the two main ideas or two main concepts being discussed, utilitarianism and contractualism. So the point is not to get caught up in the minutia of, look at these not hyphenated, these, yeah. What are
Yes, exactly. Like all of these words are, yeah. Like Bentham, Locke, not needed. 1971 publication, not really necessary. John Rawls, you don't really need to know his name. Theory of Justice, you don't need to know the name of the book. All of this stuff is not on the first read. You don't really need to know it. When they ask you about it, like in here, they asked about John Rawls. Well, who was Rawls and Rawls' theory? Well, now you can go back and you easily can find it when you see the question. But on a first read, you don't need to know all of the dates, names, titles, whatever.
So what I'm saying, it's okay not to, when you're not understanding these terminologies like veil of, could you just put it back up? Let me see.
Yeah, like
you know how they had the coded words, veil of ignorance, and I'm like, what are they talking about? Just keep going on, just keep.
Yeah, try and understand as much as you can on a first read, and then come back if needed. Once you have the whole picture, maybe certain sentences will make more sense when you already have the whole picture.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Please feel free if you have any other questions in the chat. All right. Next, I want to talk about drawing conclusions. So if you're given details, they also expect you to draw conclusions from them. To do this, you must understand what those details mean. You have to break down the sentence or sentences that you're asked about and really understand what the implication of each one is. So again, just like with cars, but especially for this, something that's hard to teach and is best improved through practice. And it, again, involves a lot of reasoning through each option, thinking critically, making some leaps when necessary, right? I really kind of want to give you an example of what I mean by this. So they gave you some details about utilitarianism and contractarianism, and they want you to make some kind of inference from the passage, right?